Hello, and thank you for joining me. There really are no words to describe how pleased I am to be a part of this virtual event, and I want to thank the organizers, especially Timmy Davis, the Maudsley Psychedelic Society, and the Psychosis Project for making this possible. I find our subject endlessly fascinating, and if I can transmit just a fraction of my interest, I hope you will too, if you don't already. My intention here is to examine the resonances between psychosis, psychedelics, and psychoanalysis that are activated by what the narrator in Philip K. Dick's 1981 novel Valis calls the twang of the void. By resonances, I am recalling first the far-out experiments immortalized in Terence McKenna's book True Hallucinations that he and his brother Dennis undertook deep in the Amazon in the early 1970s, where they attempted to use electron spin resonance literally to tune in to the cosmic frequency they believed the mushroom to be broadcasting. I'm also thinking of Eric Davis's definition in his recent book High Weirdness, paraphrased from musicologist Veit Erlman. In music, resonance is what happens, for instance, when in a room of musical instruments a note is played, say the 440 hertz of a standard A tone, on one instrument, which causes all the identically tuned strings on the surrounding instruments to resound and to continue ringing even after that initiating tone has stopped. From this and from True Hallucinations and a few other works, including those of Philip K. Dick, Davis defines resonance more broadly as a phenomenon of interpenetration and mutual participation, of the blurring of the boundary between subject and object, something that is much easier to hear than to see. Resonance is also a good name, as good a name as any, for the spark of intuition that ignites a given chain of association within the psychoanalytic clinical scene, in the dream work, for instance. It is a common term in academic discourse for the discovery of a meaningful but imprecise relation between two disparate subjects, a sort of this is like that hunch that spurs further inquiry. And finally, it is a form of coincidence. Reading The Twang of the Void, as a book like Valis makes clear, entails all of these uses and definitions. Resonance as a psychedelic hypothesis, a physical phenomenon, a fact of psychoanalytic experience, a basis of academic inquiry, a point of uncanny contact, and, to add my own intervention, the ethical and conceptual basis from which we might unsettle the stale, sedimented relation, if it is a relation, between psychedelics and psychoanalysis. And I will further suggest with Philip K. Dick that the field in which these resonances ought to be played is the domain of the psychoses, and that its instrument should be literature. In other words, Dick shows us that it is there with the psychotic, that the same frequencies within psychedelic theory and the ethics and practice of psychoanalysis most loudly reverberate. There is nothing, by the way, metaphysical about this. It is an act and an effect of reading, and one that is especially facilitated by an engagement with what I call the subject of literature, in an analogy with the Lacanian concept of the subject of the unconscious. Valis is a novel about the power of resonance, told through the story of a psychosis, Dick's own psychosis, which may have begun in February 1974, when a chance encounter with a pharmacist's assistant delivering a bottle of sodium pentothal, also known as truth serum, to relieve the pain Dick was experiencing from an impacted wisdom tooth, triggered a temporal shift, revealing that reality as we know it is an illusion. The following month, Dick was struck with a beam of impossibly pink light that downloaded into his mind an overwhelming mass of what he called living information, which after years of parsing and analysis revealed, among many other things, that he was a first-century secret Christian, a Gnostic named Thomas, conspiring with others like him to overthrow the Roman Empire. He was not the reincarnation of Thomas. He was both Philip and Thomas, and innumerable other selves laminated atop one another, because time is an illusion, everything exists all at once, and reality is a hologram projected by a deranged God who knows not what he does. Reality is a delusion, behind which hides the true, rational reality and wisdom of the source of that pink light, what he called the Logos, the Holy Other, and Valis, which is an acronym for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. The light was an instance of this rationality breaking in to deliver the good news. Differently stated, what Dick had experienced was an inbreaking of rationality into a cold, irrational, chaotic universe. And he did experience it. What is important, he would write in his monumental exegesis, is that this was perceptual to me, not an intellectual inference or thought about what might exist. It came here from the future. It was/is alive. It had a certain small power or energy and great wisdom. It was/is holy. From within me, as part of me, it looked out and saw itself. Together, these events came by Dick to be called 2-3-74, February-March 74, and he would dedicate countless hours of the rest of his life until his death by stroke in 1981 to understanding them. His medium for the construction of such an understanding was his exegesis, which he never finished and in its raw form extends to around 8,000 handwritten pages, about 2 million words, piled in no particular order. It is a tome of coincidences, in which it seems anything, TV commercials, Wagner's opera, pre-Socratic philosophy, Dick's own earlier novels, anything at all could be caught in the network of cosmic resonances and made to resemble and reveal some deeper, still occluded truth. The text aims to catalog and orchestrate all these unexpected resonances in order to reduce the cacophony and amplify the harmony of the divine mystery at work. Now, the exegesis was likely never intended to be read, and even now is only partially published and ordered somewhat arbitrarily by the volume's editors. Valis, on the other hand, is a novelization of the exegesis and of the history of its composition. This shift into literature both invites our engagement and confounds, by design, any impulse we may have to treat the novel as an instrument with which to decode Dick's madness and its etiology. And that hasn't stopped people from trying to do just that, even though Dick disqualifies this sort of psychobiography from the start. In the first place, the novel's main character, horse lover Fat, is Philip Dick. Philip being Greek for lover of horses, and Dick being the German word for fat. The first-person narrator, who both is and is not horse lover Fat, is also Philip Dick, referred to throughout simply as Phil. So, near the beginning, the narrator announces to the reader, "I am horse lover Fat, and I am writing this in the third person to gain much-needed objectivity." The novel thus affords its narrator, whom we cannot simply identify with the author of the same name, a way out of the hermetic, self-sustaining enclosure of the exegesis by splitting its subject in two. On one side, the subject of the experience, and on the other, the narrating subject who pieces it all together. This would be simple enough in an obnoxiously postmodern sort of way, but this is no Pomo revival of St. Augustine's Confessions. Fat and Phil talk to each other. They argue with one another. Near the end of the book, Fat jets off to Europe for a couple years and sends Phil postcards, or sometimes calls him on the phone. At another point, they are temporarily reintegrated, and Fat disappears, leaving Phil on his own to manage some trouble with a group of deadly psychonautical musicians chasing the resonance of the Logos. Well, he's not entirely on his own, since Phil and Fat have always had their two friends, Kevin the cynic and David the Christian optimist, who both are gradually converted to Fat's cause. There has been some speculation about who these characters may represent from Dick's real life, since the novel is clearly also autobiographical, but perhaps you may already have noticed that together these three characters' initials spell PKD. In these and a dozen other ways, the novel does not permit us to distinguish between itself and, to borrow from the title of one of Dick's short stories, real life. Nor can we suppose that the book is an exercise of schizoid insanity, since one of its prominent themes is the problem of mental illness. Whether this is a valid concept or a morally and intellectually bankrupt social construct, who decides what is rational and what is not in a manifestly insane world, and what gives them that authority anyway? So we will get nowhere with Valis if we imagine ourselves to occupy some sovereign position above and beyond it, from which we can discover the hidden wellspring of a deranged mind or arrive at a satisfying diagnosis. To do so would be to submit to, and worse, to practice the madness of the blind god, the self-deceiving demiurge, whose delusion is our reality. The delusion and occlusion against which the novel is a most vehement protest. The text thus demands, loudly and clearly, I think, that we enter into its other fabricated and entirely textual reality in order better to see the madness of our own, which may not be fiction, but is no less fabricated and is a good deal more dangerous. The twang of the void is the note which announces that supreme danger. Its rational tone rings from the harp of nihilism, lines from the book, which is plucked by the voice of Fat's friend Gloria just a week before she commits suicide. Phil sounds that twang right at the start, on page 2. Phil, the narrator, of course. And throughout, it is the siren song that the whole ensuing narrative is meant to resist, like Odysseus tied to the mast. It has no resonances beyond itself. It echoes from the heart of a total emptiness, solitude, and utter despair, within which suicide becomes a sensible solution. Against this, Valis is a way out of the void, not for Dick, the author, but for us, his readers. It is an invitation to view reality otherwise, to generate other unseen and unforeseen resonances that can imbue our insane world with the glow of mystery and the possibility of salvation. All this is the setup for my core claim. Anyone looking to reinvent the relation between psychoanalysis and psychedelics could learn a few things from literature in general and this work of literature in particular. To get there, however, we have to set Valis aside for a moment in order to contend with the original relation between psychedelics and psychoanalysis, and to see why it should be reinvented rather, I think, than merely revived. The history of that relation is the story of shy acquaintance followed by mad love, ending in ugly divorce. A full account of this dalliance would involve the whole history of the mind from the end of the 19th century to the present. So here I confine our attention only to one of those particularly formative instances of their encounter that might have been the site of a most fruitful and brilliant collaboration, namely the treatment of the psychoses. If you are at all familiar with the experimental origins of the therapeutic use of psychedelics, what today are termed the classical psychedelics, you probably know that before Dr. Humphrey Osmond gave them their new name in the mid-1950s, they were often referred to as psychotomimetics because they were believed to induce or mimic and thus permit the study of temporary psychotic states in otherwise non-psychotic subjects without any apparent side effects or long-term consequences. By the way, this research has recently been experiencing a bit of a renaissance in the hunt for more effective medicines to suppress the hallucinatory symptoms of psychosis. The field of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy was cracked wide open, however, as one might expect, once these early practitioners, Osmond foremost among them, began taking the drugs themselves. It was then that they determined that not only the study of psychosis, but the exploration of the mind as such was at stake in the psychedelic experience. This also helped vitalize the exploration of new avenues for the study of what the great psychologist William James called the varieties of religious experience in a 1902 book of the same name, which concerns James's own nitrous oxide-induced discoveries within the mystical realm. The title of James's book was the basis for Robert Masters and Gene Houston's still foundational 1966 volume, The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, while his moving appeal for the necessity of serious scientific inquiry into expanded or altered states of consciousness was constantly cited by the early knights-errant of the psychedelic counterculture, including Aldous Huxley, John Lilly, Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, nay Richard Alpert, and on and on. And so when psychedelics broke into the therapeutic scene at the peak of what we may somewhat oxymoronically call the Freudian paradigm, many researchers were sufficiently inspired by the results of their new psilocybin or LSD-assisted therapies or by their own experiences with these substances, sufficiently inspired to assert that a year's worth of psychoanalysis could be accomplished in a week or two. By the same token, Masters and Houston and many others built a body of evidence to suggest that psychedelics could precipitate the sort of religious experience to which a dedicated mystic might dedicate a lifetime of disciplined practice without achieving the same sort of drug-induced success. But you may have noticed at this point that something rather important was left behind in this enthusiasm to chart the new frontiers of inner space, to shine a light into the halls of the noumenon, quite aside from the popular enthusiasm for the discovery of an expanded consciousness that helped fuel the 60s counterculture and what Herbert Marcuse famously called the new sensibility. For what happened to the psychotic? Well, she was both left behind by the research and held up as the Gorgon's head to petrify the general population. And try freeing your mind, the message goes, and you might just lose it for good. Even at the time, the scientific literature on the question whether psychedelics could trigger a psychotic break was notoriously unreliable. Several evidence-based longitudinal studies have since supported that any causal link between psychedelics and psychosis is tenuous at best. Even so, anyone with a personal predisposition toward or even a family history of psychosis is, as far as I am aware, disqualified in advance from participation in contemporary psychedelic research. They belong inevitably to what is called an exclusion group. Now, I should clarify at this point that I have no place arguing for a revision of the present criteria for subject selection in human experiments, and that is not at all what I mean to imply. My point, rather, is that the basis of this exclusion is primarily cultural and historical, that it is built on anecdote and sensationalism and not out of research and evidence. One of the most formative papers on this subject of experimental safety with psychedelics, published by members of the Johns Hopkins psilocybin group in 2008, echoes this conclusion. There, the authors write, because of the historical legacy of sensationalism surrounding hallucinogens, researchers should appreciate the precarious position of current human hallucinogen research and recognize that very high safety standards will help to ensure that human research continues into the decades to come. They continue some pages later. Psychiatric screening criteria are important for minimizing the already low chances of precipitating a longer-term psychotic reaction by hallucinogen administration because, and I think this is a marvelous acknowledgement of the problem at hand, including volunteers with psychiatric disorders may increase the chances that symptoms from such disorders may inadvertently be misattributed to hallucinogen action. So, while the authors rightly insist on the importance of extreme caution in designing human experiments and selecting the subjects of those experiments, a key motivation for this particular caution is to avoid running afoul not of the science, but rather of the social stigma to which psychedelics remain attached, despite all the evidence, in order not to reignite the culture wars that provoked the legal crackdown from which we are just now beginning to emerge. Clearly, the lingering moral panic surrounding psychedelics, to which even mental health practitioners are not immune, is here attached to a more fundamental anxiety regarding psychiatric disorders in general and psychosis in particular. The reason why scant anecdotal evidence of LSD psychosis is so enduring, so amenable to sensationalism, and so captivating for the popular imagination is our civilization's fear of psychosis. Or, more vaguely and therefore more powerful still, its fear of madness. For while psychoses often find themselves at the center of psychological research, as we've already seen with the era of psychotomimetics, or celebrated often alongside psychedelics by culture-bound romances of genius and inspiration, those real living persons who are labeled psychotic are thereby pathologized, institutionalized, or otherwise confined behind all the conceptual and concrete walls that are built to contain them, lest their reality break free and begin to circulate like some airborne toxin or psychic contagion. This is what the cultural prohibition, to which the contemporary science of psychedelics remains subordinated, is really all about. With psychedelic research, as with everything else, we are still living in the age of what Michel Foucault, in his History of Madness, calls the Great Confinement. Foucault shows that the truth at stake in the marginalization of madness is the inverse of what it seems. It is not for the sake of the supposedly disordered that they are confined or otherwise excluded. They are excluded in order both to define and to protect what Foucault elsewhere calls the order of things. Because the best way to construct an ordered system is to determine and then excise what does not belong to it. And because an ill-fitted cog in the machine may cause the whole system, like a slip into madness, to break down. Here then is a first ringing resonance, joining psychedelics with the psychoses, precisely at the point of their culturally enforced segregation from one another. Fear of psychedelics is fear of madness. And in order to work around that fear, psychedelic researchers have to indulge it, which means also to reproduce and to reify it, to entertain the very resistances, the same prejudices their research is meant to overcome. Now, again, I'm not arguing that so-called psychotics should be administered hallucinogens. I'm also not arguing that. I'm not taking a position one way or the other. And because science doesn't take place in a vacuum, the power of social stigma and moral panic cannot be ignored, especially when we are dealing with a domain of inquiry that many of us know, or at least feel, has the potential to turn the world upside down, or maybe, as Philip Dick urges us to consider, right side up. So the question is, how do we tune those cultural resonances between exclusion and prohibition, and more generally between the Great Confinement and the legal suppression of research? How do we tune these resonances to frequencies that can break us out of this negative feedback loop? Where can we find tonalities that harmonize with this radical potential rather than stifling it? This, I believe, is where psychoanalysis makes its move. It is a founding axiom of psychoanalysis that there is no such thing as a normal personality. There are only varying degrees of discomfort with respect to the social order, which we all can find extremely unsatisfying. There is nothing wrong with this dissatisfaction, and in fact, it is an existential property of human being, a part of what it means to be human. It is, for what we call neurotics, the discontent with which we pay for civilization, our cost of entry into the social link. This means that as far as concerns psychoanalysis, the idea of pathology is an utter non-starter. Equally axiomatic is that what is called reality, more specifically the ego and its perceptual consciousness, is by no means the circumference of human experience. We say, for instance, that dreams or fantasies are not real, and yet they happen. And they have real, sometimes profound, often psychologically formative effects. The realm of fantasy is as real as reality, even more real, since fantasy can entail experiences, often far from pleasant ones, for which we can find no words, and that therefore continue to impose themselves upon us from beyond the limits of our empirical knowledge. This, by the way, is one way of understanding the Freudian concept of the Freudian conception of trauma. For psychoanalysis, it does not matter if some inassimilable event really happened. What matters is that it happened to the subject, that it is an experience which has been inscribed upon them, but in the form of an inscrutable script that yet yearns and demands to be read, which means, therefore, to be rewritten in a language other than the symptom. That's what psychoanalysis is at its base, an answer to this demand. The effort of making legible the traces of real experiences that are all the more true in that they cannot be reduced to the relatively far more impoverished level of empirical facts. At this point, I hope you are already hearing the resonance between the real of the unconscious, of dreams and unconscious fantasies, and the psychedelic reality to which so many have testified. But let's turn it up a bit. Let's play it a bit louder. It was in his return to Freud that Jacques Lacan, whose own clinical formation was steeped in the treatment of the psychoses, introduced the so-called linguistic turn into in philosophy and the human sciences into psychoanalysis. Lacan had found that the psychotic's experience reveals a fundamental truth about language, namely, that it is the ground of reality, and that reality is a linguistic and therefore a social construct. The psychotic's trouble is that the construct doesn't hold, that it is incapable of containing his experience, that it therefore enacts a positively ontological violence upon the subject of that experience, upon their very being. And, Lacan insists, the psychotic is right, with regard not only to himself, but to all of us. But whereas the expected response to this universal truth is the repression of the remainder of one's experience and its return in the form of the symptom, the psychotic undertakes to construct a new reality and another symbolic order that better fits the subject's anguish, that makes better sense of it. As Freud himself asserted, the delusion is the cure. So it makes no sense to attempt to cure somebody whose illness is a matter of our own limited perspective, the fragility, the contingency of which is the basis for all the mechanisms of confinement and exclusion that try to hold madness at bay. In psychoanalytic terms, these mechanisms are themselves symptoms, defensive reaction formations against the fact that none of us is at home in language, that something truly fundamental is missing from language, and that this something is ourselves. All of us, each in our own way. Already in the doors of perception, Aldous Huxley noted that our spontaneous everyday experience of reality is structured by the codes of intelligibility we impose upon our perception, the ways of being and knowing that we call language, which therefore is not neutral, language I mean, but by its nature limiting. We inhabit these codes and systems habitually, unthinkingly, until their hold on our perception is jarred loose. For Huxley, this is what psychedelics do. They jar us, not free, but loose for a time from our language, or more precisely, they disturb language's function in structuring and sustaining the ego and its consciousness, which, Lacan tells us in his treatment of the ground of identity, is always false consciousness. Because none of us is ever what we seem to be, especially to ourselves. Identity is imaginary. To put this resonance in other words, for Huxley, psychedelics show us the limits in which we had hitherto been ignorantly confined, and in so doing, they illuminate us and our world with the glow of as yet unthought possibility. In a Lacanian idiom, they cause a wobbling of the link between the imaginary and the symbolic, revealing to the subject that she is not so fully determined by that so-called reality as she might have assumed. This is the basis of psychoanalysis, which has always concerned the unsayable, the unspeakable, the inaddressable, and their detection in the dream, the symptom, the act. What most distinguishes psychoanalysis, however, is that all of this is driven by an ethics that lays down all pretensions to mastery or authority. The analyst is no expert, but only a joint researcher along the royal road. On this view, it is not despite, but precisely because research into psychedelics concerns the exploration of other, non-normative, indeed incommunicable realities, profoundly meaningful, but linguistically ineffable experiences. It's precisely because of this that this research demands a psychoanalytic attunement, and perhaps even begins with the same ethical injunction. The work of psychedelic theory or of psychoanalysis takes place at the limits of language, with the conviction of the truth of the subject's experience for which there are no words, the truth that cannot be translated and yet demands to be made known. Now, I'm discussing psychedelic theory, Huxley and Alan Watts and so forth, but this is true of the psychedelic science as well. Nowhere is this work at the limits of language more on display than in contemporary psychedelics research with a positivist and a behaviorist orientation. In other words, research that concerns what can be observed, measured, generalized, and in short, translated into a shared discourse. Consider, for example, the Johns Hopkins Group's 2016 paper on bad trips, which they there renamed challenging experiences. Now, the researchers find that for the vast majority of their respondents, these challenging experiences are also considered among the most important and deeply meaningful they have ever had. But what is most interesting to my mind is how they were able to arrive at such a result. The bulk of the paper is dedicated to the problem of the research method. How does one objectify bad trips in a scientifically meaningful way? What sort of experimental apparatus can distill general scientific facts from the radically singular and incommunicable experience of taking a righteous trip to the seat of one's soul or hitting the bedrock of the ground of being and living to tell the tale? What does the scientific approach permit us to learn, and what must it surrender to the other realms of the real? Let's drop the poetry. How does one generate results from the study of the far out, the mystical, the death of the ego that can be tested and repeated? This problem of devising a scientifically viable methodology, arriving at falsifiable conclusions, is a perennial one. It's the same problem Masters and Houston set out to crack in the varieties of psychedelic experience, and William James before them. It's also the problem with which Freud collided again and again, and why his writings contain constant appeals to the reader's good faith and the conviction, to use a common phrase from Freud, the conviction of the truth of the analytic experience. For Freud, the only way responsibly to proceed along the royal road of the unconscious was scientifically, through the constant testing and revision of conclusions based upon an ever-growing understanding of the observed phenomena, even though, or just because, what transpires in the clinic is by its nature so peculiar that it cannot be reproduced. After Freud and through Lacan, it is the psychotic's experience that represents the limit case of this ethics of inquiry and conviction of the truth of the experience of the unconscious. Jean-Max Godier's seminars with Françoise Devoine, recently published under the title Madness and the Social Link, make clear that the psychotic is not sick except in the laziest and most morally and ethically dubious of senses. In fact, even the term psychotic is just as lazy and dubious, since such a diagnosis, really diagnosis in general, as well as the illusion or myth of clinical objectivity, are the two primary forms of resistance against the clinical treatment of madness, which resistance belongs not to the subject but to the analyst. To impose a diagnosis is to position oneself beyond and above the subject, to pass judgment from a position of authority, which in fact knows nothing in any real way of the subject's experience, of the nature or extent of their complaint or its validity. We could otherwise say that a diagnosis is a set of expectations. A moment ago I said with Freud that the delusion is the cure. This is because it is the symbolic scaffolding with which a reality that has come untethered from its moorings can be reconstituted. The classical and most famous example of such a delusion, Daniel Paul Schreber's Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, reveals that while the psychotic is consumed by the need to discover what has happened to him and why, the horizon of this quest is actually the discovery of an other to whom that knowledge can be addressed, and with whom it may be examined. That is why Lacan finds an essential relation between psychosis and language, more specifically psychosis and writing, because a text without an addressee is a dead letter. What enlivens the letter is the subject's appeal to the reader, his desire to be read. So, if we desire to be the other of the address, and not merely just another representative of the subject's isolation and persecution by what the Godillard seminars call a, quote, ruthless intruding agency, quote, if our desire is the desire of the analyst, we will have to give up the convenient illusion that our reality is more real than that which is inscribed in the delusion. Treatment does not mean cure, certainly not chemical suppression, but rather, again from those seminars, joint research into the question, what happened? In other words, what is the historical truth that the delusion means to treat? What is the event that plunged the subject into the zone of catastrophe in which the symbolic is so shattered that time itself is suspended at the point of an all-encompassing present? What is the subjective reality from which the supposed delusion is an entirely reasonable response? How does that delusion make sense? If we undertake these questions together with the so-called psychotic, as what Andrew Feldmar, after R.D. Laing, terms a joint enterprise, then madness is not a condition to be feared or pitied. And delusion is not an irreality or an unreality or a false reality. It is a perfectly reasonable protest against the world's hostility to the subject. Some irrational violence that has become unbearable. Madness thus names not a condition but a relation, oriented by a shared interest in discovering the logic of the delusion. In other words, again, the point of view from which it literally makes sense. Such a relation might resemble the encounter the central character in Valis, Horse Lover Fat, has with the psychiatrist Dr. Stone during Fat's forced institutionalization following a failed suicide attempt. After spinning out his own private cosmology in all its eccentric glory, against his better judgment and despite his suspicions regarding the institution's hospitality to his far-out theory of everything, Fatt finds not diagnosis or clinical neutrality, not an assumed expertise issuing from someone who in fact knows nothing of Fatt's experience. Instead, he is met with earnest engagement and validation. "You're the authority," Dr. Stone tells him. With this, Fatt realized that Stone had restored Fatt's spiritual life. Dr. Stone wasn't insane. Stone was a healer. He held down the right job. Probably he healed many people and in many ways. He adapted his therapy to the individual, not the individual to the therapy. "I'll be goddamned," Fatt thought. In that simple sentence, "You're the authority." Stone had given Fatt back his soul. The retrieval of his soul here means that he has heard in Dr. Stone's voice something other than the twang of the void, a way out of his radical and persecutory solitude. He has found in this healer an other to whom his own private rationality could be addressed, with whom it could be explored. This, finally, is what inspires Fatt to build a structure of address through which he can introduce the logic of his reality into an otherwise mad world. That is what Valis is. The novel, I mean. It is the divine logos erupting into the chaos and indifference of a cold, irrational reality. The flash of insight, the revelation of a reality beyond the Roman Empire of the mind. It resonates with Huxley's account of the psychedelic experience in that it is a use not of mescaline to unsettle language's grip on reality, but of language itself against itself. A use of text that disturbs our habits and assumptions regarding the difference between truth and fiction, real and imaginary, sane and insane. And it therefore demands to be read from this position of unsettledness, as a joint researcher in the clinic of the psychoses might do. Now, the value of this intervention, the reason why I am putting it forth here, is that Dick is not our patient. In fact, he is everywhere and nowhere in the novel, both himself and not himself, author and character, subject and object, visionary mystic and lunatic speed freak, well and unwell, enlightened and occluded. Above all, he is the subject of an experience of which we know nothing beyond the texts he left behind. An experience for which there are no words. As Dick's unfinished 8,000-page exegesis makes startlingly obvious, these texts are the record, in Lacan's words, of, quote, what doesn't stop not being written, unquote. So what the novel asks of us is an attunement to the cloud of resonances that together form the gnosis, the secret knowledge, which is transmitted to us not by the subject of the unconscious, but analogously the subject of literature. The being of this subject is inscribed wholly within the text, but not without remainder. That remainder is us, the readers, and it is through our experience of reading, as should be the case, I think, in clinical experience, that these resonances resound. The resonances with psychedelics research, especially surrounding mystical and religious experience, are quite loud here. At the core of Valis is a quest to discover the homology between the microcosmos and the macrocosmos, or what Masters and Houston call, and they do use the terms microcosmos and macrocosmos, but what they also call the apprehension of an ultimate unity. It operates at the symbolic level of mystical experience, the level of what Masters and Houston also call mythological motifs that under the right psychedelically enhanced conditions, surge into the perceptual field of mental phenomena. And it does so, moreover, in a particularly contemporary way. Today, Masters and Houston explain, the mythic mantle has passed in many cases from gods and heroes and has fallen upon the extraordinary hypotheses of inner and outer space. The new scientific knowledge provides the stuff of myth-making and constitutes part of the present domain of sacred knowledge. With all its psychonautical resonators and beams of pink light and rooms glowing electric blue, with its more classically science-fictional prequel and sequels, its overlapping conspiracies and time-dilated events, Valis is a modern mythical confrontation with that same ground of being that fascinated William James and all his psychedelico-scientific progeny. In this way, the work of literature is a more powerful example of model psychoses than anything that might be found in psychotomimetics. Because its aim is not to discover more and better ways to chemically or therapeutically suppress madness. Instead, and like the psychedelic experience, it attunes us to those interferences in our reality that suggest a different wavelength being broadcast from what Freud calls another scene. Tracking these interferences, not tuning them out, but instead allowing these true hallucinations to resonate in us through the experience of reading, requires that we enter into a form of creative, critical thought, a joint research or enterprise, an interpenetrative and mutually participatory resonant effect that illuminates the madness of our reality, like a radio telescope in search of other intelligences. Valis asks that we wrest ourselves from the field of ideology whose principal function is to maintain what Foucault called the Great Confinement, and Dick and Phil and Fat called the Black Iron Prison. It takes us to the limits of language, where we might be the other of the address that rescues the psychotic's wisdom from the solitude of the void. It offers a mode for the transmission of mystical experience that no law and no review board can prohibit. And it invites us to practice an ethical receptivity to the high weirdness and enduring mystery of the human experience that should ground the new relation between psychedelics and psychoanalysis, which, to avoid the mistakes of the past, must above all be an ethical relation. So I think you should read it. Thank you.